Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Jeff Smith. Jeff is an ex-Missouri state legislator. He is also an ex-convict. In 2009, Smith lied under oath to the federal government about a seemingly minor attack ad in a congressional campaign and earned himself a year and a day in a federal prison in Manchester, Kentucky. He tells his riveting story in a terrific book entitled Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. Mr. Smith Goes to Prison is the account of his time in the big house, of the people he met there and the things he learned. As Jeff calls for prison reform, Mr. Smith Goes to Prison tracks the greatest crime of all, the deliberate waste of untapped human potential, endemic in our mass incarceration prison system. Jeff, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jim.
Well, first thing that sparked my curiosity is how did you manage to write this book when you were in prison? Did you, the guards let you write a book?
Well, I didn't actually write the book while in prison. I took notes on napkins and toilet paper and then transferred those notes to a small notepad and then stored those notes in another prisoner's cell because my cell was swept several times by the COs and kind of torn up. And then
the COs are the correction officers.
Yes. And then sent it home. And then years later, after I moved to New York City, began pitching it to publishing houses, and it turned into a book. But I didn't actually write the book while in prison, just took notes.
Let's first talk about how you happened to commit a federal felony. You were a PhD in politics. Your major was African American studies. And you ran for office, terrific campaign. You came within less than 1,000 votes of Carnahan, an entrenched political figure in Missouri. And you lost the primary fight with Carnahan and then went on to become a state legislator, a senator. What did you do that put you in prison? Seems a very unlikely background for a convict.
Definitely. So in that first race, the congressional primary in 2004, it was a 10-way primary, but Carnahan, whose father was a successful two-term governor and whose mother was a U.S. senator, was clearly the front runner. We gained a lot of ground. I was a political nobody at the start of the race, but we gathered about 700 volunteers together and were gaining ground. And then a few weeks before Election Day, two of my aides told me that they had been approached by a man who billed himself as a political practitioner of the dark arts. And he had told my aides he wanted to put out a mailer highlighting Mr. Carnahan's dismal attendance record as a state legislator. Instead of telling them, no, that seems fishy, I don't think you're supposed to coordinate with a third-party group, I told them, I don't want to know any details.
The campaign is not supposed to coordinate with a third-party group.
The campaign is not supposed to coordinate with a third-party group because it could theoretically circumvent campaign finance limits. So,
but this guy wanted to be paid. Who paid him?
My best friend gave him.
He was your campaign manager?
No, was not my campaign. He was not affiliated with my campaign.
Not at all. He was just a friend. Okay.
He was just a friend. And basically, instead of telling my aides, don't talk to the guy, or even, why don't you look into this guy's background, I said, hey, look, I don't want to know any details. Just do what you need to do, but don't tell me anything. And they did. They gave him the information about my opponent's poor attendance record. 2 weeks later, I didn't think anything was going to come of it. And so I went ahead and called a press conference on the steps of the courthouse in St. Louis and said, my opponent doesn't show up for work very much. But then the next day, that little postcard did come out, and it said essentially the same things that I had said publicly the day before. This indicated to my opponent that there had been some coordination, perhaps, between my campaign and the independent actor who put forth the postcard. He filed a Federal Election Commission complaint against me. After losing by a little more than 1% on Election Day, I signed an affidavit shortly thereafter denying any advanced knowledge about the postcard, figuring and sort of rationalizing that because I told them to keep me out of it, I could go ahead and say that I didn't really know anything. But 5 years later, when I was a sitting state senator, my best friend had about 6 weeks worth of conversations with me about that, and little did I know that he was wearing a wire the whole time. He got me to admit on that wire that I did actually approve my aide's meeting with the guy 5 years earlier.
So the feds had evidence, incontrovertible evidence, that by your own admission that your affidavit was false.
Exactly.
Now, in the course of this campaign, you started this primary campaign against Carnahan as a political unknown, and you began to gather strength as you campaigned in the neighborhoods. And I was very much intrigued with one of the techniques you used. In college, you'd been a basketball player. How tall are you, Jeff?
About 5'5".
5'5". So you were a point guard, a banger under the basket?
I wasn't a banger under the basket, but I was a kind of a penetrator and an assist man. So I was never much of a shooter, but I was a pretty good point guard.
Pretty good point guard. So you went into the neighborhoods, and what did you do using your basketball skills?
Well, in most of the streets, particularly in North St. Louis and parts of South St. Louis, there's often a basket out in the street, and kids are playing all the time in the middle of the street. And so when I was canvassing, wearing a tie, and a nice shirt, I would have my aide go up to the group of kids, or I would do it and say, hey, I'll play any one of you, the best kid here, I'll play you to 5 by ones, and whoever wins, if you win, we'll give you $5. If I win, you got to pass out these flyers on your block. And so I did that, dozens of times with kids, and I usually just took them by surprise. And before they realized what had happened, I'd already won the game. And the value wasn't necessarily in them handing out the flyers. It was more the word of mouth created by this short white guy that had just beat this, usually a 13, 14, 15-year-old black kid in St. Louis City in basketball.
So in any event, you get within a hair's breadth of victory. You're elected to the Missouri State Legislature. You're a state senator. Tell us something about some of the bills you introduced in the Missouri State Legislature.
Well, probably the bill that I was most proud of was a bill that actually dealt with criminal justice reform. We had a problem in Missouri, as you have in many places around the country, whereby a lot of men, if they lose a job, and especially if they are in the manufacturing sector or another sector where you used to be able to make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year in a manufacturing job, but now, with the decimation of that sector throughout much of the heartland, now you're lucky to make $20,000 or $25,000 with just a high school degree. Many men who were fathers in this situation who had been laid off had a child support order where they had to pay X amount of dollars based on a fairly high wage. But after losing a job, especially in auto manufacturing in St. Louis, many of them couldn't afford to pay anything close to what their child support order mandated. Unfortunately, it took almost 3 years on average for a child support order modification to make its way through the system. And by the time the modification that would adjust the support order to a lower salary that a man was making, by the time that would get through the system, the man had already probably been charged with criminal non-support, failure to pay child support. And if you didn't pay for any 6 months in a 12-month period, you were subject to being prosecuted for a felony. The problem was, in my eyes, where's the one place you definitely can't pay your child support from? Jail, right? And so we were able to pass legislation that changed many of these convictions from felony convictions to misdemeanors and changed the sentence from an automatic jail sentence to an alternative sentence, a diversion whereby fathers could get parenting classes, vocational training, substance abuse counseling if they needed it, any one of a group of wraparound services so that they wouldn't get the mark of a felony conviction, which would then keep them out of the job market, probably prevent them from getting a job that could facilitate their ability to pay child support and be involved in their child's life.
Now, the congressional race, primary race, took place in 2004, and that's when you submitted this false affidavit. And so you had about 4 years in the Missouri State Legislature.
3 years.
3 years. Now, how old were you in 2004?
29.
29 years old. The feds catch up with you, and you plead guilty to a felony because of the false affidavit. And your friend who wore the wire was involved as well. He paid off this independent consultant to the campaign. What sentence did he receive?
Probation.
And what sentence did you receive?
A year and a day in federal prison.
In federal prison. There were sentencing guidelines at the time. Was this at within the sentencing guidelines or the low end of the sentencing guidelines?
Just below the guidelines. I could have gotten as much as 3 years or so, but fortunately didn't get as much as the prosecutor was pushing for.
Now, at the time of your conviction, you were regarded as a real political comer, weren't you? You'd been the subject of a documentary relating back to the congressional campaign called Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington, which showed how an unknown citizen can make a race for Congress and almost get there.
It did. It was really more due to my volunteers and my interns than anything. I had been teaching as an adjunct professor for a few years at that point, and most of those volunteers were people who I had taught in my classes or I had met through guest lecturing in other people's classes.
Okay, so you go to Manchester, Kentucky Federal Prison. Was that the closest prison to where you lived?
No, there were prisons closer. But you're supposed to be put within a 500-mile range of where you live, and I was put, I think, 500 miles and a few tenths of a mile away.
And was Manchester a maximum security prison?
No, there were two prisons there, a medium and a minimum. I lived in the minimum and worked at the medium.
And what does that mean? Does that mean barbed wires and high walls and guards with machine guns? Or?
That's what it was at the medium, where I worked at a food warehouse on the loading dock. At the minimum, no, we were surrounded only by natural barriers. It was in sort of the crater of an old defunct coal mine. And
tell about some of the crimes that your fellow prisoners had been convicted of, and some of the sentences that were imposed on them.
Most of them had mandatory minimum sentences. Most of the black
for narcotics violations.
For narcotics violations, mostly for either crack or for meth. Many of them had a gun on their case, so that put an extra 5 years on their mandatory minimum. So most either had 5 or 10 for the drugs, and then an additional 5 for the gun on their case. Some had a sentencing enhancement for selling drugs too close to a school or a park. So the sentences ranged anywhere from 5 to 17 or 18 years. I had probably just about the shortest sentence of anyone there.
And were any sentenced for crimes of violence apart from those that had guns who were drug dealers?
There were some people in for assault with a deadly weapon.
And what was the ethnic composition of the prison? How many whites, how many non-whites?
It was a little more than half black, a little less than half white, and then some Latinos.
And what was the educational level of most of the prisoners with whom you had contact?
Most had a GED that they'd earned in prison.
Gee, that's a high school education, earned in prison. Were there? Did you meet any other PhDs?
No, there was one lawyer in for a few months at the start of my time.
They put a lawyer in jail? Well, that's terrible. What happened to him?
You know, I can't even remember. I think he had signed a false affidavit as well. And then there was a stockbroker who was in for siphoning off money to feed a gambling addiction from his client accounts. But I'd say it was probably less than 1% white collar.
And is it, you're 5 feet 5 inches tall, a point guard. Is it fair to say that most of your fellow inmates were much taller, much rougher than and rough and tumbling than you are?
Well, I think that's accurate. Yeah, you can see if you look at the picture on the back of the book, you can see the colleagues who I worked with in the warehouse on the loading dock. I had 6 colleagues there, and I think they weighed 230, 250, 260, 270, 305, and 350 pounds. So at first, I was really kind of disappointed to get that job because
how much did you weigh at the time?
I weighed 117 when I went in. and most of the meat came in 80-pound boxes, and the beans and the sugar, the rice and the flour came in 100-pound bags, and so it was very difficult for me to catch and throw it when I first got to the warehouse. But it was a real blessing in disguise to get that job assignment, because the guys who were my colleagues in the warehouse, a few of them became close friends and really looked out for me back on the yard, and I needed that.
It's fair to say you were kind of a fish out of water in prison, isn't it?
I was, but I tried not to let that stop me from getting to know other people on the yard, and I met some of the most amazing people that I'd ever met in my life. There's a tremendous amount of untapped entrepreneurial potential inside of our prisons. One of the common misconceptions about prison life is that you've got it made. You've got 3 hots and a cot, you're all taken care of. Actually, most prisoners are destitute. They have to pay for their own deodorant, their own soap, their own shampoo, their own toothpaste and toothbrush, and most of them have no means to do so. They don't have anyone.
Do they have the funds to make phone calls to their friends and relatives on the outside?
Not unless you have someone who's sending money in. And because of our asset forfeiture laws, most guys, especially guys who were drug dealers, are totally cleaned out, and they don't have any means of income except what they make in their prison job. For my prison job, a 40-hour-a-week job unloading the food that came in, I made $5.25. That's not an hourly wage, that's a monthly wage.
Okay, so you were assigned to unload food in a warehouse with some others in a medium security wing of the prison where you were. Did you tell them that you had a PhD and maybe you could conduct classes and teach the other prisoners how to become productive members of society after they'd paid their debt?
Well, during my intake, they asked me, education level. I said PhD. The woman said, what's last profession? And I said, state senator. And she replied, well, this is my Kentucky accent here. She said, well, if you want to play games, you can play games. We got ones here think they're Jesus Christ, so you ought to fit right in. So I guess she didn't believe me. And then when I applied to teach 4 or 5 different courses, and I wrote up curricula to do so, but all of my requests were ignored. And then I finally did get transferred to the education department with a few weeks left in my sentence. But when I got there, the head of the education department, the guard who ran it, asked me my education level again, and when I told him, he threw a broom at me and told me to start sweeping the classroom.
Was there a solitary confinement block within the prison?
There was a solitary confinement block at the medium, yeah.
At the medium. And were people sent from the low security to the solitary confinement block for infractions or alleged infractions?
Yes, frequently.
Justice Kennedy in the recent Davis case, I'm sure you're familiar with it, raised the question as to whether solitary confinement isn't cruel and unusual punishment.
And in fact, nearly every other civilized nation in the world has concluded that it is.
Some inmates who have solitary confinement go mad. Others, like Khalif Browder, who was released from Rikers Island at 2 years in solitary, no trial, and he committed suicide. But they continue to enforce it. What kinds of infractions would get you solitary confinement?
Well,
I take it you never had it.
I didn't. I had a situation where I may have ended up having a close call. It's a long story, but when I got to the warehouse, I was told that some other prisoners were going to plant raw meat in my freezer jacket. Being caught stealing raw meat is an infraction akin to inciting a riot, because if stored improperly, it could spread E. coli across the whole compound and maybe even kill people. So I did what I needed to do. I had to start stealing food in order to get them not to plant raw meat in my freezer jacket, because they had thought, since I wasn't stealing during my first week, that I was going to rat my colleagues out for doing so.
As long as you're on the subject of stealing, you encountered instances of corruption, didn't you? Weren't there some of the COs, as you call them, the guards, stealing food and meat from the prison?
Definitely. It was something that you saw frequently.
This is a business. People are providing goods and services to the prison, including telephone services.
Until a recent ruling by the FCC just a week or two ago, phone calls could cost as much as $14 a minute inside of prison. Most of the ones where I was cost between $1 and $2 per minute. And so if you're only making $5 a month, you don't have a lot of time or the funds to pay for calls, to keep in touch with loved ones. look, we know there's two things that can reduce recidivism. One is keeping prisoners in touch with loved ones back home in their community.
Recidivism is repeat offenders.
Exactly. And the second way that we can reduce it is by facilitating educational advancement by prisoners. And in the prison where I was, both of those things were sort of actively impeded and definitely not facilitated by the prison.
Was there an atmosphere of violence? Did you witness instances of violence accomplished by prisoners against other prisoners or accomplished by guards against prisoners?
I didn't. There were a lot of fights among prisoners, and I got in a couple scrapes on the basketball court, as you can read about in the book. But I didn't see any guards commit violence against prisoners. I saw them rough them up, but not like a severe beating, just sort of a rough, grabbing them and taking them to the SHU. The SHU is solitary confinement.
Were there complaints by other prisoners that guards had roughed them up?
Sure, absolutely. And the surest way to get roughed up again was to file a formal complaint. Everyone understood that there's something called diesel therapy. If you're someone who makes a habit of filing formal paperwork against the prison, then it's oftentimes you would end up in this so-called diesel therapy, where you would just be handcuffed and put on a bus or a series of buses, and you'd travel around the country. Every week or two, you'd be in a new jail, basically in a circle, until they got you where they wanted you to go. But the 6 months you spend doing that, you can't have visits, you can't communicate with people, and you basically have to learn how to deal with a new group in every prison where you're set for a week or 2 weeks. It's no way to live.
Now, you are a student and a teacher of public policy. Does society, particularly American society, have a need for mass incarceration? Is there something embedded in the fabric of society that creates the need for this?
Look, we're locking up more people than Stalin did. We lock up way more people as a percentage of our population than China, than Iran, than the worst dictatorships in the world right now. 2.2 million people. And that means that 1 in every 750 or so people in this country is incarcerated. The statistics for minority males are an abomination. They're far worse than that. So
part of that is because of this spurious, in my view, distinction between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine, where
that's exactly
for crack
right.
cocaine you can get a sentence 18 times that, used to be 100 times that, of what you get for powdered cocaine.
Right,
it's the same drug.
Yeah, you have to have 18 times as much powder cocaine to get the same sentence that you would get for that amount of crack, which is crazy.
And of course, crack cocaine is the drug of choice usually for African Americans and minorities, and powdered cocaine for Hollywood producers, and so there's that distinction.
Exactly. So do we really need mass incarceration? I would argue that mass incarceration is not making us safer, but it's actually probably making us less safe, because right now our recidivism rate is approaching 75%. Right? That means almost 3 out of 4 people are going to reoffend. We are locking people up for over long terms. We're keeping them away from their families. We're spending billions of dollars, and we're doing nothing while people are inside to rehabilitate them. And in fact, there are many respects in which prison is creating better criminals as opposed to rehabilitating them. So we've long passed the time when incarcerating people was making us more safe.
By the way, did you encounter instances of racism? I mean, who was getting the higher paying jobs in prison?
For the most part, whites were getting the higher paying jobs. I was rare working on the loading dock, being at a fairly arduous job that didn't pay well. The dry goods section of the warehouse, where you didn't have to lift things nearly as heavy, where you brought in things like chairs or other materials, you were paid a lot more for less arduous work. So there was some racial hierarchy, but mostly race is kept to themselves. Prison is a very segregated place, and you're not supposed to eat with members of another race or fraternize with them in most settings.
Now, President Obama recently paid a visit to a federal prison, highly publicized. He was perhaps the first sitting president to do so.
He is.
It raises the question. He wanted to reduce the prison population. He said we should distinguish between violent and nonviolent criminals. We could talk at great length about that, more time than we have. But I have a question for you. What do we do about our flawed prison system?
So the first thing we need to do is look at sentencing reform. and get rid of mandatory minimums. Judges don't want their hands tied in the way they have been. They have a lot of situations, many who I've spoken to about this, I'll be on a panel next week about this as well, where judges don't want to put someone away for 15 years, but they have to because their hands are tied by the law. So the first thing we need to do is look at sentencing reform, and not just mandatory minimums. The second thing we need to do is look at what we're doing inside of prison. We need to facilitate the ability of prisons and wardens to provide serious, high-quality education programs. We know that every $1, based on a recent RAND Corporation study, every $1 that we spend inside prisons can save taxpayers up to $6 in reduced costs related to recidivism. So we have to treat prisoners more humanely, because if we don't, they won't act in a humane way when they come out of prison. And then third, we've got to do better on reentry and provide people the support they need to succeed when they get back out. Right now, the reason prisoners reoffend is because of financial struggle. They can't get jobs. 9 out of every 10 employers perform background checks, and 4 out of every 5 landlords do. Because of the prisoners, when they come out, have the added stigma of a prison record and are returning to communities where they've already failed once before, they need extra support in place to help them get a job, and we need more employers who are willing to step up and make that happen.
More employers are willing to step up. Jeff Smith, we've run out of time. I'm very sorry, because this is fascinating. Thank you so much for coming by. Good luck with your book, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.